The world defines worldly wisdom as experience, knowledge, and judgment that makes a person difficult to shock or deceive. Worldly wisdom is of, relating to, or devoted to this world and its pursuits, rather than to religious or spiritual affairs. So I think they got that down pretty good. A Christian once said to me, told me that he met an elderly gentleman that was wiser than anyone else he'd ever met. And I think I shared this with you before. That is wonderful. But he was only referring to worldly wisdom, as that man could have had nothing to do with God. He was worldly wise. That isn't a bad thing, but it must not get confused with wisdom that is from above, that comes from God and is about religion and spiritual matters. But that's often the case that happens. People will mix and mash worldly wisdom with wisdom from above, and doing that, you're risking an eternal danger. There are 35 verses in the Bible that talk about worldly wisdom, and not one of them speak of that wisdom in a positive light. There is nothing positive from a spiritual standpoint regarding the wisdom of this world. The Bible says things about worldly wisdom when it comes to religion, like it is earthly, it is unspiritual, and demonic. It is, or professing to be wise, they became fools. Or they have the appearance of wisdom, but have no spiritual value when it comes to matters of God. So people sometimes get that confused. But we don't want to get that confused, because wisdom from above outshines the wisdom of this world. Shortly after Trudeau won the election, he made his agenda clear, stating that Christianity was our problem in society and that he never met a more spiritual man than the imam over the worldly affairs of the Muslim world. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 and 20 asks 4 questions. He says, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? The answer is that the wise, the debater, the scribe, are all proven foolish in their worldly wisdom by the wisdom that comes from above, that comes from God. God makes us a promise through the Apostle Paul in his Corinthian letter. He says, the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And then he says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, that is, the wise of the world, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Worldly wisdom doesn't stand up to the godly wisdom. And so the world has a hard time with this, because they want to be wise, the wise ones, and that just makes them foolish. But the wise person is the one that acknowledges the wisdom of God and humbles himself before God. So let's take a look what James has to say in James chapter 3 and verse 17 concerning the wisdom that comes from above. We'll look at that wisdom that the Lord reveals to us through James by inspiration. The first thing about the nature of the wisdom from above is its purity. Wisdom from above is pure. It is prudent, discretion, it's godly knowledge, all reduced to practice, actually living it. It is used in ways most suitable to accomplish God's given mission for our lives. The wisdom from above, James 3:17 says, is foremost pure. Wisdom from above, then, is void of any kind of evil or ugly pollutants that worldly wisdom is contaminated with. Anyone who attains this wisdom A virtuous humility overcomes them as a temple that is inhabited by the divine God of heaven. There is, in all desecrating principles, thoughts and purposes are excluded. That's not involved in the wisdom from above. It has no questionable, immoral, or improper actions. It utters no words of lies or slander. A person is wholly consecrated to God, living life as Jesus gave us the example to do. That is the wisdom from above. In 1 John 3 and verse 3, he teaches us, everyone who thus hopes in him, that is, hopes in Jesus, purifies himself as Jesus is pure. To that end, Jesus came to purify each one of us with his cleansing blood, to get rid of the contaminants of the world, setting us free from those things so we can live a pure life by the wisdom of God. Paul also told Timothy, when he was talking to him, he said, do not take part in the sins of others, but keep yourself pure. And so purity is the beginning of this wisdom. It is pure. James says this wisdom of God is also peaceable. This is the direct result of being pure. Consider this. When men have no false or wicked purposes or agendas, the peace is never broken. Do you realize that? There has been no dissension between friends, no divisions or ruptures in the church, never a rebellion in any nation, never a war between nations, never a wicked controversy of any kind, which did not all come about or have its origin in some impurity of the soul. You can take that to the bank. It's the truth. Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Jesus is saying that people who live by God's wisdom are indeed the people of God. They'll be recognized as such. The Hebrew writer teaches us in Hebrews 12 and verse 14, he says, strive for peace with everyone and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. So as the saints, as Christians, we have to remember that we are to be peacemakers, for that is the wisdom of God. Jesus, by the wisdom of God, became our peacemaker, and so we in turn also want to be peacemakers. That is part of the wisdom that comes from above. The nature of God's wisdom is also gentle. Nothing good has ever been accomplished by people of violence, people who act in anger, who have to have things their way, come what may, or bend people to their beliefs. There has never been anything good come out of that. Jesus didn't do that. If you look at the scripture, you read your New Testament, I challenge you to show me a time where Jesus tried to force somebody by anger or by any kind of violence or anything else to bend to his will. He didn't do it because he realized we all have choice. He would love us to choose to follow him. Absolutely. But he doesn't force anybody. He didn't do that. He let people make up their own minds. Being convicted of right, having a firm faith in the final triumph of right, all that is needed is for you to speak the truth with gentleness. There's no need for you to get angry and upset. The person in error should be regarded by us as unfortunate. And we must pity them like one who is deathly sick. Think about that. Because they are spiritually sick if they are in error. Gentleness is a strength of wisdom. The man who has this wisdom, having come by it by reason rather than emotion or passion, is grounded in God and doesn't need to blow others up, because he realizes he accomplishes more with the gentleness than with anger and arguing. And so we see that the nature of God's wisdom is pure, peaceable, and gentle. And now I want us to look at the character of that wisdom. First thing James says is it's open to reason. Flying ant. The man who is under the influence of the wisdom from above is open to reason. James seems to indicate here that the posture of the man's soul, when others are trying to convince him otherwise of their ways, is open to hearing what they have to say. It doesn't mean he believes it, but he's open to hearing it. This man is not so stiff, stern, and obstinate and unyielding that he won't hear something else other than what he believes. He knows what he believes, but he does not take a position and then hold it unyieldingly, whether it is right or wrong. Because perhaps in some reasoning, he's overlooked something in his understanding of things. And so he is not argumentative, but he is persuasive. The man under the influence of God's wisdom is always willing to retrace his steps, maybe study the passage again, and if he's made an error, correct it and not let his pride get in the way of admitting his wrong. If he's right, what's there to lose? The other person will see it just as he sees it, because it's what it says. And so he won't waste time and energy trying to hold on to an unattainable position. He will not yield to any force that is not reasonable, but he is not too good or too prideful to hear another's reasoning, even though it may not be found in truth. So the man is open to reasoning. And if you think about it, Jesus said, reason with one another in the scriptures. So reasoning is part of it, because it's reasonable. Another characteristic of the one who has the wisdom from above is being full of mercy. It is important that we keep the dots connected between God and the wisdom that he gives. They are one and the same in character and nature. So we're talking about God's wisdom. So we're talking about God. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 4, Paul says, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." Can you imagine being here without the mercy of God? We wouldn't be. None of us would be here. The man that has the wisdom from above will not waste time, the person with the wisdom of God in their lives considers the state of the other person's soul, situation, and eternal good, and then proceed with compassion and sympathy for the other person, wanting, in other words, what is best for them, and not reacting negatively to their current state or demeanor. And I say that not because it's easy, it's something you have to work on doing, but it's something that we need to be doing. It's how Jesus handled things. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7 it says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." So I guess if you want mercy, you ought to try being merciful. That's what Jesus says. In Luke chapter 6 and 36, it says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. So the wisdom that comes from above is merciful. And that is in direct opposition to what people think wisdom in the world is. As a result of that mercy, the man with the wisdom of God abounds. He gushes forth good fruits. That's literally what James is saying. He's overflowing with good fruit. He produces in his life the goodness of God in every situation. When I was 12, I picked cherries in the summer time. 12, 13 years old, I picked cherries for an orchardist. And we came across a tree that looked really healthy and really strong. And the fruit, the cherries on that tree were so small and they didn't fill out and they were kind of shriveled. And I looked at the orchardist and I said to him, I said, what's wrong with this tree? And he said, what's wrong with it, you cannot see. You cannot see inside of that tree. If you were to look inside of that tree, he said, you would find it rotten and decaying. But outside it looked great. And that year he cut that tree down and planted a new tree. Because that tree wasn't bearing fruit and it was dying. It was dead. I now grasp the full impact of what he told me. You cannot know what is in the heart of a person. You can't see what is in the heart of a person. You see the exterior only. Now, God sees the heart, but I'm talking about us. So you can't see except what you see on the exterior. And so what we can know is the fruit that they produce in their lives. We can actually know what's on the inside only by the fruit that it produces or that person produces in their lives. A person who is not influenced by the wisdom of God cannot bear good fruit or godly fruit, because we cannot do that of ourselves. However, the person who is influenced by God's wisdom bears good fruit, and it is known by all whom that person talks to, works with, and crosses paths with. The character of the wisdom that comes from above, as the inspired James teaches us, is totally opposite, almost totally opposite, to what the wisdom of the world says. But there's still one more aspect that I want us to look at about this wisdom. And it affects our attitude. Having the right attitude in any given situation is by far the hardest thing for most people to do. James says wisdom from above is also impartial. Now think about this for a minute. On more than one occasion, I have been accused in the years past of being impartial to one person or another, or impartial to my family. And that's okay, that happens. And it happens most often when there's two people involved in something, and both those people will come and say, I'm impartial to the other one. Now think about that for a minute. Can I be impartial to both? Is that how it works? It doesn't work that way. But I say that to say this. Wisdom from above will not change what the truth is, whether when it comes to loved ones. Impartiality does not change the truth based on someone's monetary value or a person's position that they hold in the world or in the church. I was asked one time if one of my children were living in adultery and refused to repent, would I disfellowship them? And I said, yes, absolutely. And the person was shocked that I would disfellowship a member of my family from the church. And I said, first of all, it's not my decision. It's God's decision. We go by his word. So it's not up to me. It's up to the church, the entire church. But right is right and wrong is wrong. And family doesn't change that. Position doesn't change that. Good friendship doesn't change that. Nothing changes what is God's. What God has decided is right or wrong. What God has decided is good or evil. Nothing changes that. And so we don't have, the wisdom from above doesn't have that partiality. Because God himself doesn't show partiality to anyone. The wisdom from above is also sincere. It literally means that this person, what James is saying here in the Greek, literally means that this person is free from all hypocrisy. Now think about that for a minute. You might already know where I'm going with this, but Jesus had a lot to say about the sin of hypocrisy. Jesus said a lot to show the ugliness and the destructiveness of hypocrisy. And as with all sin, God hates hypocrisy because of the damage and the destruction it does and the evil that it is. I was asked by a gentleman recently why Jesus talks so much about hypocrisy. The answer, I told him, is Jesus, who hates sin, knew the Jews' sinful condition, and he talked about it because it was one of the most blatant sins that cried out amongst the Jews. Hypocrisy was that the Jewish people were full of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is not of God. God is not a hypocrite. God is forthright with what he says is true, what his will is, what his desire is, who his children are. It's all like it's written in stone. When he says it, that's the way it is, and it won't change. And nothing and no one will change it. It's just that way. It's sincere. Those who are under the influence of God's wisdom then are not hypocrites either. They do not act like something they aren't to persuade people. You are who you are. You are sincere in your faith and your service and your relationship with God. And people just want to see that sincerity. I have found that out through time in working with the church, that people are more interested in if you're sincere with them or not. So sincerity has to be part of that wisdom. I have witnessed people who want a great harvest in the church, and they get ahead of God and they start doing things the way they think that they should be done to get people into the church. It's no problem to do things and be creative in doing some things as long as it all lines up with the will of God and his righteousness. That's the key. But people have done outlandish things, sinful things, in the name of building the Lord's church. And they call it the Lord's church. It's their church, but it's not the Lord's church. I want to say the Lord's church is not built this way. Never was. It never will be. There will be. People have done things. It's kind of disturbing, but people have done things like bring in big bands, rock bands, to rock the house down so that they bring people in, entertain people. People have done things, and it's horrible, but there's a church in New York that had strippers in it to draw in people because they called that love. And there's all kinds of things like this have happened out there. Folks, that's not building a church by the wisdom of God. That is so far from it, it's terrible. James says the wisdom of God is how you build a church. We sow in peace, we make peace, which results in a harvest of righteousness. Doing things right in God's eyes. That's righteousness. Everyone I know wants to be part of a harvest of righteousness, but not everyone I know wants to work in that harvest with the guidance of the wisdom from above. And therein lies a huge problem. When James makes this statement, the opposite of this would be someone sowing falsehood, chaos, controversy, and whatever else that you can think of. And in turn, they think they're going to reap a harvest of righteousness, but they're not. They're going to reap a harvest of unrighteousness, and they will be very disappointed. Isaiah says the effect of righteousness will be peace. James says it the opposite way around. If we sow in peace, we'll have a harvest of righteousness, but the righteousness of God will bring us peace. Of our own accord, we cannot produce the righteousness of God. Only when we are influenced by the wisdom that comes from above. So where does this leave us? Well, I pray it leaves us desiring and seeking out the wisdom from above. Lee Strobel, when he was still a writer at the Chicago Tribune, received a phone call from a father desperate to find his missing 19-year-old daughter. He said she was a good girl, never in any trouble, just an innocent child, and now she's gone. The police were not helping him to find her, and so he asked if Lee would alert the city of the missing girl so they could find her. Moved by his anguish, he began to pursue the story. He interviewed the daughter's friend and he talked to the police, and he found a very different story. Tragically, it turned out that she was a drug addict and a petty criminal, a girlfriend of a gang member, and a part-time prostitute. When the police found her body a few days later, the coroner determined that she had died of a heroin overdose. Lee didn't have the heart to tell the father all the details, because the father truly believed that she was an innocent child. But oh, was he wrong. His love for his daughter blinded him. He was seeing only what he wanted to see and was overlooking the obvious clues of her demise that pointed in a completely different direction. And the saddest thing of all is that if he had just acknowledged those things, he may have been able to help her to get out of that mess. But he blinded himself to thinking she was just a good girl, innocent girl. Wisdom from above doesn't work on the basis of feelings, emotions, or even beliefs or convictions, unless those beliefs and convictions are in God and His Word. Wisdom from above doesn't work on the basis of partiality because they are friends and family. The truth or condition doesn't suddenly change. Wisdom from above does not operate on the basis of prejudice, anger, pride, or arrogance. These things do not accomplish the righteousness of God. Wisdom from above does, however, work on the basis of humility before God, accepting what God says is right and wrong, good and evil, truth and lie. Wisdom from above is from God, and it is the very character, nature, and attitude of God in all His holy wisdom and divinity. And therefore, when we are pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reasoning, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial and sincere, we will indeed be peacemakers as our Lord is a peacemaker. And we will be joined with our Father in heaven in a harvest of righteousness. I encourage all of us to have the desire for that wisdom from above, to seek it out, and to practice it in our lives daily, as James has given us the inspired instruction to do. If you need help with that, or you want to first become a Christian, you're not a Christian, We'd like to help you with that. So all we need you to do is let us know. And now we're going to sing some praise to our glorious Father in heaven.